The year was 1981. The era, known to the West as the era of stagnation, felt to those inside simply like permanence. It was the gray, immutable winter of the Brezhnev regime, a time of absolute bureaucratic certainty. In Moscow, this certainty was codified in endless corridors of beige-painted concrete and the pervasive chill that clung to the city long after the snows had melted. Nowhere was this permanence more tangible than in the new nerve center of the First Chief Directorate, the PGU, located in the sprawling modern complex at Yasenevo, far from the city center, nestled anonymously in the woods. This was the world of Viktor Nikolaevich Orlov. Viktor was a man designed for this environment. He was 47 years old, of average height, with thinning brown hair and eyes the color of the Moscow sky in November. His face was unmemorable, his posture slightly stooped, a human semicolon in the long sentence of the state. He lived alone in a small apartment on Prospect Mira, his personal life as meticulously ordered and empty as the files he managed. Viktor was a senior archivist, grade the 3rd, in Department Phi, the section of the PGU responsible for the active archives of Directorate S, the Illegals program. His job was one of immense, unseen trust. He did not run agents. He did not analyze intelligence. He was a custodian of memory. He managed the physical files, the legends, the birth certificates, the operational histories, and the emergency protocols for the Soviet Union's deep-cover assets abroad. His department was the institutional brain, the paper record that proved who was real, who was legend, and what the mission was. His superior was Colonel General Ivan Zaitsev, a man who had come up through the Second Chief Directorate, counterintelligence, and retained its characteristic suspicion. Zaitsev was a formidable presence, broad and severe, a true believer who trusted the documented word above all else. To Zaitsev, a fact did not exist unless it was recorded, stamped, and filed in triplicate. His faith in the archive was absolute. A man can lie, Zaitsev was fond of saying in departmental meetings. A man can be turned. But the paper is loyal. The paper remembers. Viktor Orlov's days followed a rhythm as unchanging as a metronome. The 0630 metro, the crush of gray-coated bodies, the shared smell of cheap tobacco and damp wool, the long bus ride to the Yasenevo complex, the series of security checks, the outer perimeter, the building entrance, and the final steel-gated door to Department 5, which required both a key and a daily numeric code. Once inside, the atmosphere changed. The air was dry, filtered, and kept at a constant temperature to preserve the documents. The only sounds were the whisper of ventilation, the soft scrape of chairs, and the muted clicks of typewriters. Viktor's small metal desk sat at the end of a long row. He was good at his job. He was precise, patient, and, most importantly, invisible. He understood the complex cross-referencing system, the color-coded file jackets, and the elaborate sign-out procedures that required multiple authorizations for any file designated Osobaya Papka, special file. He was trusted. He was the man who could locate the 1968 operational plan for a Belgian asset in 20 minutes, when it might take others an hour. But Viktor Orlov held a secret. It was a cold, dense object he carried in his chest, a counterweight to the crushing grayness of his life. His father, a historian at Moscow State University, had been taken in 1950, a victim of the final paranoid spasms of the Stalinist regime. He had simply disappeared, vanished from life, and then, more completely, vanished from the records. Viktor had spent his youth trying to find a trace, a document, a grave. He found nothing. He had learned then that the state's true power was not just in its ability to control the present, but to erase the past. His career in the archives, he sometimes mused, was a quiet, lifelong irony. He was now the guardian of the very machine that had consumed his family. This irony had calcified over decades into a quiet, profound cynicism that he masked with perfect bureaucratic compliance. The seed of Viktor's secondary life had been planted 4 years earlier, in 1977. He had been sent to East Berlin as part of an archival exchange with the Stasi. It was a trip of profound dullness, filled with meetings on card catalog standardization. On the third evening, he was approached at a reception by a man who introduced himself as a Swedish academic studying comparative documentation. The man was, in fact, David Sterling, a CIA case officer operating from the Helsinki station. The recruitment was gentle, almost imperceptible. It was not a plea for ideological defection. Sterling, through subsequent carefully managed meetings, simply offered Victor a way to correct the record. He spoke of history, of truth. He offered no vast sums of money, only a sense of purpose, a quiet validation of the anger Victor had suppressed for 30 years. By the time Victor returned to Moscow, he had a code name, Librarian, and a simple method of communication involving coded messages left in public library books. For 3 years, his work was low-level. He provided procedural details, changes in security protocols, the floor plan of the new Yasenevo archive, the names of department heads. He confirmed the status of certain assets the West suspected were doubles. It was useful, but not damaging. It was a slow game of patience. Victor felt the quiet hum of purpose, a secret warmth. Then, in the spring of 1981, the tension in the archive shifted. It began not with a bang, but with an audit. A junior archivist in a different section, a young man named Andrei, was found to have misfiled a stack of surveillance reports. It was a simple human error. But in General Zaitsev's department, there was no such thing. Zaitsev made an example of him. Andrei was not simply reprimanded, he was transferred. 2 men from the second directorate arrived one afternoon, and Andrei was escorted from the building. He was never seen in the archive again. The rumor was that he had been sent to a processing post in Siberia, his career finished. The incident sent a ripple of cold fear through the department. Security protocols, already strict, became stifling. A new dual signature rule was implemented. Any special file now required a sign-out sheet initialed by 2 archivists and countersigned by a shift supervisor. Random spot checks of desks and briefcases became common. The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz with a new accusatory frequency. Victor felt the pressure. His quiet work for Sterling had been manageable under the old rules, but the new system made any unauthorized access a significant risk. He signaled this to Sterling through a dead drop in a Gorky Park trash receptacle. The reply, when it came a week later, was not what he expected. Sterling was not asking him to pull back. He was asking him to escalate. The early signs were not just the KGB's internal paranoia. They were the prelude to a new, far more dangerous phase of his operation. The CIA no longer just wanted to read the KGB's memory. They wanted to rewrite it. The discovery was not a document, but a concept. It arrived in a hollowed-out book on Russian architecture, passed to Victor by a cultural attaché from the Swedish embassy at a state-sponsored concert. Inside was a microfilm canister. That night, in his small apartment, Victor projected the contents onto his bathroom wall. It was a directive from Sterling, outlining a plan so audacious it made Victor's blood run cold. It was codenamed Operation Paperweight. Sterling's analysis, transmitted on the film, was precise. The CIA had concluded that the KGB's greatest strength, its reliance on a centralized, paper-based archive, was also its greatest vulnerability. General Zaitsev's fanatical belief in the loyal paper was the key. The memo read, "The target is not the files. The target is the system's faith in itself. We will not steal their history. We will poison it." The plan was terrifyingly simple. Victor was not to exfiltrate files anymore. His new task was to insert files. Sterling had managed to acquire, through another asset, a significant quantity of authentic KGB file jacket stock, the specific beige cardstock used for Directorate S, including the correct watermarks. He had also acquired a typewriter from the same manufacturing batch used at Yasenevo. Victor's mission was to meticulously fabricate and insert new contradictory information into the existing archives. He was to create ghosts. He would add reports from non-existent informants, fabricate operational expenditures, and, most critically, alter the emergency contact protocols for active illegal agents. He was to create files that looked, felt, and smelled exactly like the real thing, but which contained subtle, corrosive lies. The objective was to create a series of operational failures that could not be traced to a leak or a mole, but only to a contradiction in the KGB's own records. The discovery Victor held in his hand was the realization that his handlers wanted him to weaponize the very concept of bureaucratic certainty. They were going to make Zaitsev's loyal paper lie to him. Victor stared at the wall for an hour. This was not the quiet correction he had signed up for. This was an act of profound sabotage. It would not just expose the state, it would cripple its functions, potentially endangering agents in the field on both sides. But it would also be the ultimate revenge on the system that had erased his father. The machine that had used paper to delete a man would now be undone by paper. He burned the microfilm in an ashtray, the small flame reflecting in his glasses. He would do it. Victor began the work of Operation Paperweight in the deep winter of 1982. The timing was perversely perfect. The health of General Secretary Brezhnev was failing, and the entire state apparatus was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The internal security services, focused on the coming political transition, were more paranoid than ever, but their focus was upward, toward the Politburo, not downward into the stacks. Victor's position as a senior archivist gave him access, but the new dual signature protocols were a problem. He could not simply check out a file. He had to invent a reason to. He began to use the system against itself. He initiated a cross-referencing integrity audit for the West German sector, a project so mind-numbingly boring that no one else wanted any part of it. General Zaitsev, a man who loved audits, approved it immediately. This gave Victor a plausible reason to have multiple files on his desk at once. His surveillance was twofold. He watched his colleagues, noting the habits of the shift supervisors, the patterns of the guards, and the exact moments when his section was quietest. And he meticulously surveyed the files themselves, identifying the perfect targets. He chose the file of Werther, a deep-cover illegal operating in Bonn, West Germany. Werther was a highly valued asset, an engineer inside a major technology firm. His file was thick, complex, and cross-referenced with Directorate T, scientific and technical. Victor's hands, covered in thin cotton archivist's gloves, trembled almost imperceptibly as he opened the red-tabbed special file. He brought the file to his desk, along with 4 others, under the guise of his audit. He worked through his lunch break when his colleagues were in the canteen. He carefully, using a solvent, lifted the wax seal on the file's inner operational protocols envelope. Inside, he found the emergency contact procedure, a sequence of coded signals and a contact number for a handler in East Berlin. At home, he had already prepared the forgery. It was a single sheet of paper, Amendment 4A, typed on the acquired typewriter, using the exact formatting, terminology, and authorization codes. It was a work of art. It looked identical to every other document in the file, but it changed the emergency number to a non-existent, dead line. He aged the paper slightly with a weak tea solution, a trick he had read about. The next day he began the second phase of surveillance, the KGB's internal security. He needed to insert the document, but the archives were under periodic, silent observation by second directorate officers posing as archival assistants. Victor had to wait for 2 weeks, his heart a cold stone, until his shift aligned with a supervisor he knew to be lazy. On a Tuesday afternoon, the supervisor was distracted by a phone call. Victor's desk was shielded by a tall shelf. It took him less than 10 seconds. He unsealed the envelope, swapped the authentic protocol sheet for his forgery, and resealed the envelope with a small, concealed tool and a drop of wax from a perfectly matched candle. He placed the authentic sheet in his sock. He then returned the file to the central vault, signing it back in. The first poisoned seed was planted. He felt no triumph, only a vast, cold emptiness. The confrontation was not a dramatic shootout, but a slow, agonizing bureaucratic collapse. It happened in May 1982. In West Germany, a NATO counterintelligence operation, unrelated to Victor's work, had suddenly tightened its surveillance on the technology firm where Werther was embedded. The asset felt the pressure and, following his training, initiated his emergency exfiltration plan. He sent the first coded signal. No response. He waited 12 hours and tried again. Nothing. Growing desperate, he dialed the emergency contact number, the one Victor had fabricated. The line was dead. Panicked, Werther broke all protocol and made a frantic, unsanitized call to a known KGB safe house, a call that was immediately intercepted by West German intelligence. The safe house was exposed. Werther managed to escape, fleeing east with nothing, his network in ruins. But he was blown. The operation was a catastrophic failure. The immediate fallout landed on the desk of the PGU's European department. The operational report was scathing. The asset was lost. The network compromised. But the vital question was why? Why had the emergency protocol failed? The station chief in East Berlin swore his team was waiting for the signal on the correct frequency, the one in his copy of the operational plan. General Zaitsev was summoned. He was livid. He demanded the master file for Werther from Department V. He laid the file, Victor's poisoned file, on his desk. He compared it to the report from Berlin. The confrontation was immediate and stark. The file in Zaitsev's hand, the master document from the Loyal Archive, contained an Amendment 4A with a dead phone number. The Berlin station's copy issued 2 years prior did not have this amendment. Two official contradictory realities now existed. This was Zaitsev's nightmare. It was not a leak. A leak meant a human had failed. This was worse. This meant the paper had failed. The archive, his temple of certainty, had lied to him. Paranoia exploded in Yasenevo. Zaitsev locked down Department V. All audits were suspended. All access to the Directorate S stacks was frozen. He called in the second directorate, not as observers, but as inquisitors. The system, faced with an impossible contradiction, turned on itself. An internal investigation, designated Case 771, was opened. Its purpose, to find the source of the documentary contamination. Zaitsev, in his rage, did not see the truth. He was the one now spreading the poison, validating the CIA's premise that the files could not be trusted. The confrontation was the system's war with its own memory. The exposure was not of Viktor Orlov, not at first. The focus of Case 771 was on the impossible. How could a forged document, Amendment 4A, exist in the master file? The investigators, men from the second directorate who viewed the intellectuals of the PGU with contempt, began their work with methodical suspicion. They started with the file's access logs. They interviewed, one by one, every archivist, supervisor, and guard who had signed out the Werther file in the past year. This, of course, included Victor. Victor's interview was held in a small, windowless room within the Yasenevo complex. He was not accused. The two investigators were polite, almost bored. They asked him about his cross-referencing integrity audit. Victor explained his process, his voice steady, his hands clasped. He feigned a helpful, bureaucratic tone. Yes, I recall that file. It was part of the 7B series. I was checking it against the acquisitions log for Directorate T. He was the perfect gray archivist. The investigators made a note and dismissed him. He was just one of 12 names on the log. But Victor knew this was only the beginning. He had to accelerate the plan. He had to spread the contamination faster, make it impossible to trace back to one file. He needed to make the entire archive suspect. He executed the second phase of Operation Paperweight. This time, he didn't alter a file. He created one. He fabricated an entire special file for a non-existent American mole, a ghost asset supposedly operating within the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. He codenamed the ghost Argus. The fabrication was his masterpiece. It included surveillance reports, contact logs, and most importantly, financial receipts authenticated by Department K, the KGB's internal counterintelligence. He used a moment of lax security during a shift change, when the vaults were being transferred, to slip the file onto a to-be-cataloged cart. A junior archivist, seeing the official jacket and codes, processed it without question. Argus was now part of the permanent record. The exposure happened a week later. The second directorate, expanding its audit, stumbled upon the new file. A mole in the U.S. Embassy, handled by Department K. This was a political bomb. The investigators took the file straight to the PGU leadership, but Department K, when consulted, had no record of Argus. They declared the file a fabrication. Now the crisis was total. The investigators were faced with two contaminated files. The first, Werther, involved a subtle forgery. The second, Argus, was a complete, audacious fabrication, and it implicated a rival directorate. The paranoia turned to infighting. General Zaitsev used the Argus file to accuse Department K of running an off-books operation and framing his department. Department K accused Zaitsev of gross incompetence, or worse, of planting the file himself to cover the Werther failure. The archive was no longer a source of truth. It was a contested battlefield. The leadership was paralyzed. They could not determine what was real. The investigators, now desperate, looked again at the access logs for both files. Only one name appeared on every relevant list: the helpful archivist who had been conducting the integrity audit, Viktor Orlov. The arrest was silent. There were no sirens, no public confrontation. At 4:59 p.m. on a Friday, 1 minute before his shift ended, Viktor's desk phone rang. It was General Zaitsev's secretary. "The Colonel General would like to see you, Viktor Nikolaevich." Viktor wiped his glasses. He placed his pen in his desk tray. He stood up, tucked in his shirt, and walked the long corridor to Zaitsev's office. When he entered, the general was not alone. The two investigators from the 2nd Directorate were there, their expressions no longer bored. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. Viktor Orlov was not taken to a formal prison. He was transported, in a black Volga, to a safe house in the Moscow suburbs, a dacha requisitioned by the 2nd Directorate for sensitive internal matters. There was no formal charge, no trial, no lawyer. There was only the process. His interrogators were not the same men from the office. These were specialists. They worked in rotating 8-hour shifts, a lead interrogator and a note-taker. The room was comfortable, almost pleasant, with a table, 2 chairs, and a samovar that was always full of hot tea. The politeness was the most unsettling part. They never raised their voices. They never laid a hand on him. The pressure they applied was purely psychological and bureaucratic. For the first 2 days, they did not ask about espionage. They asked about procedure. "Viktor Nikolaevich, let us review the sign-out log for 14 February. You requested the bond file. Your audit proposal, however, only specified the 12C series. The bond file is 7B. Can you explain this small discrepancy?" Viktor clung to his cover. The 12C files were cross-referenced to 7B. It was a standard verification. But the audit charter does not mention 7B, a small oversight perhaps. But you, Viktor Nikolaevich, you are not a man for oversights. You are meticulous. They presented him with stacks of paper, sign-out sheets, archival transfer forms, typewriter maintenance logs. They questioned his authorizations, the timestamps, the color of the ink he used. They made him recount his daily schedule, hour by hour, for the last 6 months. They forced him to detail the archival process for a new file and then, hours later, asked him to do it again, checking for the slightest variation. It was an interrogation by minutia. They were drowning him in the very bureaucracy he had sought to master. After 48 hours, with no sleep, the fluorescent lights of the room seemed to pulse. On the 3rd day, the tone shifted. The lead interrogator placed 2 documents on the table: the authentic Werther protocol sheet, which they must have found hidden in his apartment, and the forgery. "One of these is ours, Viktor Nikolaevich. The other is not. But it was in our file. It was in your hands. You are the custodian. You failed in your duty to protect the record. You allowed this contamination." Viktor stared at the papers. He had no more bureaucratic answers. He feigned confusion, then terror. I don't understand. It must have been, Andrei, that young man who was transferred. He was careless." The interrogator smiled, a thin, cold expression. "Andrei has been accounted for. He was careless. You are not careless. You are precise. This forgery is precise." They did not need a confession. In a system built on paranoia, suspicion was the same as guilt. His trial was this room. His inability to prove his innocence was the verdict. They knew he was responsible, but they could not understand the motive. Was it money? Ideology? Was he working for a rival, Zaitsev, or for the West? To the KGB, the why was less important than the what. And what had happened was unthinkable. The archive was compromised. Viktor Orlov was the human symbol of that compromise. He had to be erased, just like the files. After 72 hours, he was given a document. It was a confession stating that, due to severe personal stress and ideological deviation, he had engaged in procedural sabotage. He signed it. The interrogation was over. The immediate aftermath was swift and clinical. The political implications of Case 771 were too vast to be processed through normal channels. It was a crisis of state security at the most fundamental level. If the PGU's central archive, its brain, was vulnerable, then every operation, every agent, every piece of intelligence for the last decade was potentially suspect. A secret Politburo-level commission was convened, led by the head of the KGB himself. General Zaitsev was called to testify. He was a broken man. His faith was shattered. He could no longer trust the paper. He could not defend his department. The commission's finding was pragmatic and ruthless. The contamination was of unknown depth. It was impossible to audit every single file. The risk that other ghosts like Argus or other amendments like 4A were lying dormant was unacceptable. The entire section, the active files for Directorate S in the European theater, was declared compromised. The order was given. It was not a public decision. It was a quiet, internal directive to sanitize the archive by fire. Trucks were not brought in. The destruction happened internally, in the high-temperature incinerators located in the sub-basement of the Yasenevo complex. For 3 nights, men from the internal troops, men who did not know what they were burning, wheeled gray metal carts filled with thousands of files. They fed the life's work of a generation of spies into the roaring furnace. The loyal paper that Zaitsev had revered, the legends, the operational plans, the hard-won secrets, and Victor's fabrications all turned to indistinct gray ash. The KGB was forced to reboot its European illegals program, a setback that cost them years and millions of rubles. Operation Paperweight had succeeded beyond Sterling's wildest dreams. The personal consequences were just as silently managed. General Ivan Zaitsev was not reprimanded. He was retired due to failing health. He was given a comfortable dacha outside Moscow and a generous pension, and was never allowed to set foot inside a KGB facility again. He spent the rest of his life gardening, a man haunted by the ghost of a file. Viktor Orlov vanished. He was not sent to a gulag. A public trial was impossible. It would admit the vulnerability. Instead, he was officially diagnosed with a severe paranoid delusional disorder by a state psychiatric board. He was transferred to a special facility, a place with no name, where political and ideological patients were held indefinitely. His name was stricken from the employment rolls. His apartment was reassigned. Viktor Nikolaevich Orlov, like his father before him, became a non-person. Years passed. The Soviet Union itself began to crumble. The stagnation gave way to the chaos of perestroika, and then, in 1991, the entire system collapsed. The KGB was splintered, its archives thrown open, sold or stolen. In 1995, in a quiet suburb of Arlington, Virginia, David Sterling, long retired from the CIA, was being interviewed by a young agency historian for an internal monograph on Cold War psychological operations. Sterling, now in his late 60s, sipped his coffee and reflected on the operation. Paperweight was ambiguous, Sterling said, his voice dry like old leaves. We never got a full damage assessment. We knew it caused a hurricane inside Yasenevo. We heard rumors of a purge, a cleanup. We knew Werther was blown and that a few other operations suddenly went dark. But we never knew for sure. The historian prompted him. And the asset? Librarian? Sterling stared out the window for a moment. Viktor Orlov, a good man, a quiet man. We had an exfiltration plan for him, but he never used the signal. He was taken before we could get him out. We assume he was removed. His file was closed. He did what he did not for us, but for his own reasons. For his father, I think. He wanted to prove the system that erased his family was, itself, fallible. The legacy of Operation Paperweight was profound, if unseen. The 1982 file purge created a black hole in the KGB's institutional memory. When the new Russian government tried to take stock of its assets, it found entire networks were undocumented. Agents who had been loyal to the USSR were cut loose, their files lost. But it was a double-edged sword. The West, which relied on defectors and stolen documents to understand its adversary, also found itself blinded. The files they did manage to acquire from the 1990s chaos were incomplete. The truth of many Cold War operations was missing, incinerated in the Yasenevo furnace. Viktor Orlov hadn't just made the KGB destroy its own files. He had, in a small, significant way, destroyed a part of the world's collective memory. The history of that conflict on both sides would forever have a missing chapter. The case of Viktor Orlov, or Librarian, is not a story of triumphant espionage. It does not fit the narrative of defectors fleeing to freedom or high-stakes exchanges on a Berlin bridge. It is a story about systems and the quiet, corrosive power of doubt. The Cold War was understood as a conflict of ideologies and nuclear arsenals, but at its core, it was a war of information. It was a contest between two systems, each obsessed with total control, total knowledge, and absolute certainty. The CIA, with its technological focus, and the KGB, with its bureaucratic dogma, both believed that if they could only know enough, they could control everything. Viktor Orlov's act of sabotage was unique. He did not use a bomb or a weapon. He used the KGB's own nature against it. He weaponized bureaucracy. He exploited the fatal flaw in a paranoid system, its pathological need to believe in its own infallibility. The moment a document, the holiest of relics in the Soviet state, was proven to be a lie, the entire structure of belief was threatened. The purge of the Directorate S archive was a systemic immune response. Faced with a virus of disinformation it could not isolate, the system chose to amputate a part of itself. The destruction of the files was not an act of madness, but a deeply logical, if desperate, act of self-preservation. To save the idea of the archive, the physical archive had to be sacrificed. In the end, the consequences were ambiguous, as all things in that shadowed world were. Viktor Orlov was removed. David Sterling retired without ever knowing the full truth. The files were gone, leaving a void that benefited and blinded both sides. The system itself, though wounded, endured, reforming into new, leaner organizations that learned from the mistakes of the past. The story is a quiet tragedy. It illustrates that in the gray, impersonal struggle between monolithic state apparatuses, victory is often indistinguishable from loss. Viktor Orlov set out to correct the record of a system that had erased his father, and in doing so, he forced that system to erase itself. It was a profound, hollow, and perfectly anonymous victory.